October 27, 1943, 5 hours and 45 minutes in the morning, Naval Base, San Diego, California. Robert James McCarthy, 17 years and 11 months, adjusted the steel helmet that danced loosely on his not yet fully developed head as he walked up the gangplank of the USS Chicago, a Northampton-class heavy cruiser preparing to sail for the South Pacific. His long, slender fingers, more accustomed to holding chemistry books and test tubes in the school laboratory than the M-Mill Garand rifle he now carried awkwardly on his shoulder, trembled slightly in the cool dawn breeze. Californian. Robert had lied about his age at the recruiting station 3 months earlier, adding exactly 10 months to his date of birth to reach the required 18 years. The recruiting sergeant, a weary World War I veteran with 38 years of service, had looked at Robert's obviously young face, at the clearly altered birth certificate, and simply stamped the papers without comment. In October 1943, the United States Navy desperately needed bodies to man the ships rolling off the production lines in record numbers, and it didn't ask very detailed questions. Robert's mother, Catherine Elizabeth McCarthy, 42, a widow who worked double shifts at a munitions factory in Los Angeles to support Robert and his 3 younger sisters, believed that her oldest son was finishing his senior year of high school and preparing to enter the University of California at Berkeley in the fall of 1944 on a full scholarship in chemistry. Robert had forged his signature on enlistment papers, forged a permission letter, and created an elaborate lie about a scientific internship program that would explain his prolonged absence. He sent carefully worded letters through a friend who posted them from Los Angeles to maintain the illusion. Catherine would never know, not for years, that her brilliant boy, who had won the county's top science student award and dreamed of finding a cure for the polio that had killed his father 5 years earlier, was about to be used as part of a risky naval strategy that knowingly placed the most vulnerable and least experienced ships directly in the path of the Japanese offensive to protect more valuable aircraft carrier groups. Robert was one of approximately 7,500 young men under the age of 18 who had lied about their ages and now served on United States Navy surface ships in the Pacific Theater, many of them assigned specifically to escort cruisers and destroyers operating in the most dangerous positions of battle formations. 3 months earlier, in Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, 59 years old, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet and architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor, sat in his austere cabin aboard the super battleship Yamato and studied intelligence reports on the composition of American naval crews with growing satisfaction that bordered on disdain. He had recently returned from an inspection tour of Japanese naval bases in the South Pacific and was compiling his observations for the High Command into a detailed report that would be read by Emperor Hirohito himself. Yamamoto, educated at Harvard from 1919 to 1921 and fluent in English, considered himself an expert on psychology and American capabilities, and his reports carried considerable weight. He scribbled notes in his meticulous handwriting, the brush moving with precision across the thin rice paper. The intelligence reports before him, compiled by Japanese agents in neutral Lisbon and Switzerland through observation of American recruitment records inadvertently published in local newspapers, painted a picture that Yamamoto considered revealing of fundamental American weakness. The United States was recruiting boys, literally children. The average age of new cruiser and destroyer crews had dropped to 19 and a half, a drop of 4 full years since 1941. More disturbingly, reports indicated that approximately 15% of the crews were under the age of 18, many as young as 16 or 17. Yamamoto called his senior intelligence officer, Captain Kameto Kuroshima, 47 years old, and read aloud the most revealing passages. Kuroshima, Americans are so desperate for men that they put high school students to operate warships. Our sailors are on average 26 years old, all with at least 3 years of rigorous training at the best naval academies in the world. Our anti-aircraft gunners practice 8 hours a day for 2 years before seeing actual combat. And Americans send children who barely know how to tie a nautical knot. He slammed the report on the table with a gesture that mixed triumph and contempt. This confirms what we have always known. The Americans have numbers, they have industrial production, but they do not have the warrior spirit, the discipline, or the experience necessary for naval victory. When our battle veterans meet these inexperienced boys in the next big clash, it will be a massacre. They will panic under our accurate fire, make basic navigational and gunnery errors, and their inexperienced officers will not have the tactical wisdom to respond effectively. Kuroshima nodded in solemn agreement. Admiral, our estimates suggest that we can sink 3 American ships for every one we lose, perhaps more, simply by exploiting your inexperience and youth. Yamamoto smiled slightly, a rare expression on his normally impassive face. Exactly, Kuroshima. Americans build ships quickly, but they cannot build experience quickly. And now they put children on these ships, children who will go home crying for their mothers when the first bombs fall. This isn't a war fleet, it's a floating kindergarten. What Yamamoto did not know, what none of the Japanese analysts had noticed in the carefully sifted intelligence reports, was that the extreme youth and inexperience of the American crews was not a sign of accidental desperation but part of a calculated and deeply cynical strategy, developed in the closed rooms of the Pentagon by naval planners who had reached a grim conclusion about how to win a war of attrition in the Pacific. Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, 58, 36-year veteran of naval service and architect of American amphibious warfare doctrine, sat in a windowless conference room in the third basement of the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. on July 15, 1943, and presented to a select group of senior officers a strategic analysis that would fundamentally change how the United States Navy would utilize its human resources. Turner, known for his brutal frankness and willingness to accept sacrifices that other officers found morally problematic, did not soften his words. "Gentlemen," he began, "we face a simple but brutal mathematical problem. The Japanese have better trained sailors, more accurate gunners, and superior naval tactics developed in 2 decades of continuous fighting in China. Ship by ship, crew by crew, they surpass us in experience and skill. Our only advantage is industrial production. We can build 5 ships for every one they build, but ships without crews are useless, and we can't train sailors at the speed we can build ships." Turner pointed to a chart on the wall that showed projections of naval casualties. "If we place our most experienced and valuable crews on all ships equally, distributing the experience, we will lose ships at a rate that will eventually exhaust our production capacity. The Japanese will target and sink our best ships with their best crews, and gradually erode our combat effectiveness." He paused, letting the implication hang heavy in the silent air of the room. "But," he continued, "if we concentrate our most experienced crews on our most valuable ships, mainly aircraft carriers and new Iowa-class battleships, and put young, inexperienced crews on escort cruisers and destroyers that we use as, let's be honest here, decoys and damage absorbers, the Japanese will waste ammunition, time, and tactical effort on secondary targets while our main forces remain intact and effective." Captain Arthur Davis, 43 years old, Naval Personnel Planning Officer, raised his hand hesitantly. "Admiral Turner, are you proposing that we deliberately place our youngest and least trained crews on the most vulnerable ships, essentially using them as human shields to protect our most valuable assets?" Turner looked Davis straight in the eye without blinking. "Captain, I am proposing that we use our human resources in the most efficient way to win this war. Yes, young crews on escort cruisers will suffer higher casualty rates. Yes, we will lose more of these ships. But every cruiser they sink full of 18-year-old recruits is an aircraft carrier they are not attacking. An aircraft carrier crewed by 3-year veterans that can launch 50 planes and sink 5 Japanese ships. It's brutal math, but it's correct math." The room was silent for long seconds. Finally, Admiral Ernest King, 64 years old, Commander-in-Chief of Naval Operations and the most powerful naval officer in the United States, who had remained silent throughout the presentation, spoke. "Turner is right," he said simply. "It's not glorious. It's not what we'll tell mothers. But it's what we need to do to win." Approved. Implement immediately. The policy was encoded with maximum security rating. Escort cruisers and destroyers would receive lower priority for experienced veterans. Newly formed crews, many composed of recruits who had completed only 12 weeks of basic training, and 4 weeks of specialized technical training compared to the 9 months to 2 years of training that sailors received before the war, would be preferentially assigned to these ships. Experienced officers would be spread thinly, usually 1 or 2 veterans per entire ship, enough to maintain basic discipline, but not enough to compensate for widespread inexperience. And crucially, recruitment would be expanded to accept even younger volunteers, with age verification made deliberately lax. American mothers, writing anxious letters to sons they believed were finishing school or starting civilian jobs, would never know that their boys were being strategically placed in the most dangerous positions of the Pacific Naval War, not despite their youth and inexperience, but precisely because of it. Robert McCarthy learned to operate the Bofors 40mm anti-aircraft gun during exactly 6 days of accelerated training in San Diego before boarding the USS Chicago. 6 days to master a weapon that Japanese snipers had practiced for 2 years. 6 days to learn aircraft identification, lead calculation, weapons maintenance, emergency procedures, and combat teamwork. His instructor, Warrant Officer James Wellington, 34 years old, and a veteran of the Battle of Midway, had done his best with the impossible time allotted. Wellington had 35 recruits in his training class, ranging in age from 17 to 21, none of whom had even seen an anti-aircraft gun before 2 weeks ago. He took them through loading and firing drills repeatedly, shouting corrections and encouragement in equal measure. "McCarthy, you need to reduce your reload time by 4 seconds or you'll die when a Zero dives into your ship," Wellington bellowed as Robert struggled with the heavy ammo clips that weighed 50 pounds each. Robert was 6 feet tall but weighed just 150 pounds, all teenage bones and nerves, and his arms shook under the weight. At his side, 17-year-old Timothy Chen, the son of Chinese immigrants from San Francisco who had lied about his equal age to Robert, managed to reload in 43 seconds, still 8 seconds slower than combat standard. "Better, but not enough," Wellington commented, his voice carrying barely concealed paternal concern. He knew these boys weren't ready. They weren't even close to ready. But orders were orders, and ships were leaving daily for the South Pacific regardless of the crew's level of preparation. On the 6th and final night of training, Wellington gathered his class in a quiet corner of the training ground, out of earshot of senior officers. "You're good boys," he said, his voice hoarse from 6 days of constant yelling. "You learned quickly. You worked hard. But I'm going to be honest with you because no one else is going to be. You are not ready for this. 6 days of training is not enough. You will make mistakes, you will panic, you will do things that will get some of you killed." He looked at the young faces illuminated by the dim light of the camp's security lamps. "But you can survive if you remember 3 things. 1. Trust your teammates. You are stronger together than alone. 2. When the shooting starts, your bodies will know what to do because we've practiced these moves 1,000 times this week. Let instinct take over. 3. Don't consider yourself heroes. Consider yourself survivors. Your job isn't to sink every Japanese plane out of the sky. Your job is to get back home to your mothers." Robert committed these words to his memory, not knowing that they would save his life in less than 3 weeks. Aboard the USS Chicago, Robert was assigned to Gunnery Team Number 7, operating one of 12 Bofors cannons mounted along the ship's sides. His team consisted of 5 men, himself as primary shooter, Timothy Chen as loader, David Martinez of El Paso, Texas, 17 years old. As observers, James O'Brien of Boston, 18 years old, as secondary shooter, and William Jackson of Birmingham, Alabama, 19 years old and the only one with more than 6 months of service, as team leader. The combined age of the 5 was 92. Jackson, with his 19 years and 6 months of experience, was considered the wise veteran of the group, although he himself admitted in private conversations that he barely knew how to properly tie all the required nautical knots. The commanding officer of the Chicago's Artillery Division, Lieutenant Philip Harrison, 24 years old and a graduate of the Annapolis Naval Academy exactly 18 months ago, had under his command 147 men operating 15 different weapon systems. Of those 147, 23 were under 18 61 were under 20, and only 9 had more than 3 months of actual combat experience. Harrison, who should have been commanding perhaps 40 men under pre-war naval doctrine, was dramatically overstretched and knew it. He spent 18 hours a day trying to turn teenagers into gunners, knowing that weeks or days after they left San Diego, they would be under attack by Japanese pilots who had spent 5 years bombing Chinese cities before Pearl Harbor even happened. At Rabaul, Papua New Guinea, the Japanese Naval Air Base and Command Center for Operations in the South Pacific, Captain Minoru Genda, 39 years old, naval aviation officer and primary tactical planner for coordinated airstrikes, conducted a briefing for 62 Zero fighter and Val dive bomber pilots who would participate in a massive coordinated attack against the next major American naval formation detected by reconnaissance. It was November 2, 1943, 3 days after the USS Chicago and her task force of 5 cruisers and 8 destroyer escorts departed San Diego. Genda, a veteran of attacks on Pearl Harbor, the Battle of the Coral Sea, and Midway, was widely considered one of the best naval air tactical analysts in the world, and his pilots absolutely respected him. He pointed to aerial reconnaissance photographs showing typical American naval formations taken during the previous 2 months. "Observe the pattern," he instructed in Japanese, his calm but authoritative voice filling the stuffy hangar. The Americans always place their least valuable ships on the periphery of their formations: old cruisers, escort destroyers, tankers. In the center, well protected, are the aircraft carriers and new battleships. Our intelligence indicates that these peripheral formations are manned predominantly by young recruits with minimal training. The Americans are using them as disposable shields. Genda smiled slightly, a predatory gesture. This is both a weakness and a sign of American desperation. They give us sitting ducks full of inexperienced crews who can't defend effectively. Our primary objective remains aircraft carriers, of course, but if we can't penetrate directly to them, we can inflict massive losses on their escort ships, killing their young crews, sinking their cruisers, and forcing their aircraft carriers to withdraw or risk being left without protection. A veteran pilot, Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, 27 years old, with 64 confirmed victories and a combat veteran since 1938 in China, raised his hand. "Captain Genda, is our intelligence on the ages and training levels of these American crews reliable?" Genda nodded. "Very reliable. We have reports from multiple sources confirming that the average age of American cruiser crews has dropped to approximately 19 years old. Many are high school students who lied about their ages. Your training is measured in weeks, not years. Comparatively, the average age in this room is 26, and each of you has at least 3 years of combat flight training and averages 80 hours of actual combat." He let the implication weigh. "When you attack these ships, you will face teenage gunners who can barely follow their planes with scopes, who will panic under pressure, whose officers are almost as inexperienced as they are. Explore this. Make fake passes to trick them into wasting ammunition. Attack from multiple directions simultaneously to overwhelm your limited tracking capabilities. Remember, they are children trying to do men's work. Treat them as such." The room erupted in confident smiles and affirmative comments. The Japanese pilots, veterans hardened by years of combat, felt that their next missions would be little more than target practice. What Genda and his pilots didn't understand, what no amount of intelligence reports could have conveyed, was that youth and inexperience did not necessarily mean cowardice or incompetence. They simply meant that the reactions of these young crews would be different, unpredictable, not conditioned by established doctrine or procedures. They meant that when faced with impossible situations, these teenagers would improvise in ways that seasoned veterans, confident in their rehearsed routines, would never consider. They meant that the fear of disappointing comrades, of being seen as a coward by friends of the same age, would sometimes overcome even the instinct for self-preservation in ways that would surprise enemies who expected immediate collapse under pressure. November 7, 1943, 14 hours and 23 minutes, approximately 380 kilometers southeast of Rabaul, Solomon Sea. The USS Chicago was sailing in defensive formation with 4 other cruisers and 6 destroyers, when radar detected a hostile air formation approaching from the northeast. a distance estimated at 50 miles. The battle warning siren sounded through the ship, a piercing sound that made Robert's heart leap into his throat as he and his team raced to their positions on Beaufort's gun number 7. It was Robert's first real battle alert, and his hands were visibly shaking as he checked the weapon's feeding mechanisms. Timothy Chen began stacking ammo clips beside him, his breathing coming in short gasps. David Martinez in the binoculars was frantically turning his head, trying to spot the enemy planes that were still beyond visual range. William Jackson, the team leader, noticed the growing panic in his men and shouted over the alarm. "Focus, guys. Exactly how we practice." McCarthy, take a deep breath. Remember what Wellington said, let your muscles do the work. Robert followed the advice, forcing himself to take 3 deep breaths, feeling his heart rate slow from a frantic race to a fast but controlled beat. He had practiced these movements 1,000 times during 6 days of training, and his muscles really knew what to do even though his mind was screaming in terror. The Japanese formation, consisting of 28 Val bombers escorted by 16 Zero fighters under the command of Captain Genda, watching from a command plane at a safe distance, approached the American task force in perfectly coordinated attack formation. Genda, via radio, directed 6 Zeros to make low strafing passes on the escort cruisers first, a standard tactic to suppress anti-aircraft fire before the bombers began their dives. The Zero pilots, confident veterans, descended for their attack runs expecting scattered and poorly coordinated anti-aircraft fire from terrified gunners. What they found was different from what they expected. Robert's team, along with dozens of other young teams throughout the formation, opened fire not with perfect accuracy, but with absolutely savage volume and desperate determination. Robert followed the first Zero as it dove toward the Chicago with his scope, his finger pressing the trigger before it even had the proper lead. Red tracers arcing far behind the fast plane. Rookie mistake. Exactly what instructors had warned against. But as the Zero began its climb, Robert instinctively adjusted, not by precise calculation, but by raw instinct, and his second burst sliced through the plane's tail. It wasn't a killer shot, but it was enough damage. The Zero shook, black smoke pouring from the engine, and although the pilot managed to keep it aloft, he was forced to abort his attack run and turn around to attempt an emergency landing at Rabaul. Timothy Chen, operating purely on the autopilot of fear and repetitive training, kept the ammunition clips feeding so quickly that the cannon nearly overheated. David Martinez called out target identification so loud and high-pitched it was almost a scream, but his calls were accurate and helped Robert switch targets quickly. The scene repeated itself throughout the formation. Young crews, terrified but functioning, dumped anti-aircraft ammunition in volumes that Japanese pilots had not experienced before. Not because these crews were more skilled, but because their inexperience meant they didn't conserve ammunition, didn't worry about overheating barrels, didn't follow controlled fire doctrines. They simply shot at everything that moved in the sky with the frantic determination of teenagers fighting for their lives. The cumulative effect was surprising. The Val bombers began their dives through this unexpected wall of fire. 3 were hit during descent and exploded into orange fireballs that painted the afternoon sky. Another 5 were damaged enough to drop their bombs prematurely or miss their targets by wide margins. The Japanese pilots, accustomed to accurate but limited anti-aircraft fire from veteran gunners who followed conservative fire doctrine, found themselves navigating through an absolutely chaotic density of tracers that, although often inaccurate, created an intimidating psychological barrier. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, a confident veteran who had expected easy targets, found himself repeatedly forced to divert from attack runs by volumes of fire that defied his previous experience. He would later describe it in his diary. It was like flying through metal rain. It wasn't precise fire, it was desperate fire, but there was so much of it that precision became irrelevant. Each time I lined up a target, tracers appeared from 3 different directions, forcing evasive maneuvers. These were not the reactions of experienced gunners following established procedures. They were the reactions of men fighting with pure survival instinct. The USS Chicago took 2 direct bomb hits, killing 17 men instantly and injuring 43 others. One of the dead was James O'Brien of Robert's team, killed by blast fragments when a bomb struck 20 meters from his position. Robert saw his friend fall, half his face simply gone, and for 3 seconds he froze completely, his mind unable to process the horrific transformation from living person to dead flesh. William Jackson shouted in his ear, "McCarthy, focus, we have more enemies coming, don't let O'Brien die for nothing." Robert doesn't know how, but he keeps shooting. His hands operated the weapon mechanically while his mind was somewhere far away, protected by the shock. Later, military psychologists would call this combat dissociation, but at that moment Robert simply did what his minimum 6-day training had programmed into his muscles. The attack lasted 27 minutes. By the time it was over, the American task force had lost an escort destroyer completely sunk with 183 crew killed, and 3 cruisers, including the Chicago, significantly damaged. Total American casualties: 216 killed, 337 wounded. But Japanese losses were far higher than any pre-attack projection. 11 Val bombers destroyed, 4 severely damaged beyond repair, 5 Zeros shot down, 3 damaged. Of the air crews, 26 pilots and gunners killed, 12 injured. Most critically, the strike's effectiveness was only 52% of projected. Major American forces remained intact, and operational costs to achieve limited results were unsustainable. Captain Genda, receiving reports from surviving pilots, experienced profound confusion. Its veterans had reported fierce resistance from crews that intelligence promised would be inexperienced and easily overcome. Something was wrong with the basic assumptions. In Washington, D.C., 4 days later, Rear Admiral Turner received reports of the battle at his desk in the Pentagon. He carefully read analyses of damage, casualties, and defensive effectiveness. The numbers confirmed exactly what their strategy had predicted. Young, inexperienced crews on escort cruisers had suffered disproportionately high casualties compared to ships with more experienced crews, but they had fulfilled their primary role of absorbing enemy attacks and protecting higher-value assets. Aircraft carriers in the formation had not been touched. Turner wrote a note in his review. Staffing strategy confirmed effective. Continue current policies. Expand recruitment of young volunteers. The cold cynicism of this note, its implicit recognition that young crews were consciously treated as expendable resources, was never made public. The memo was classified as secret, archived in security vaults, and would remain unknown for 52 years until partial declassification in 1995. Turner never expressed public remorse for the strategy. In post-war interviews, he defended the choices as mathematical necessities of total conflict, arguing that alternative would have resulted in higher overall losses and possibly strategic defeat. He was probably correct in purely numerical terms, but numbers do not capture the human reality of mothers who lost children, whose deaths were the result not of the chance of war, but of deliberate calculations about the relative value of human lives. Catherine McCarthy received the telegram on November 23, 1943. The War Department regrets to inform you that your son Robert James McCarthy was killed into action in the Pacific Theater on November 7th. She read the words 3 times before her brain processed them. Robert was dead. Her brilliant son, her boy who should have been studying chemistry and preparing for college, was dead. But how? He wasn't even in the Army. He was at school. He had sent a letter just last week talking about a science project. Confusion competed with pain until Marine Corps Casual Officer Sergeant William Thompson, 41, showed up at his door to gently explain that Robert had enlisted 3 months earlier, had lied about his age, and had been killed during a Japanese air raid in the Solomon Sea. Catherine literally collapsed, her legs giving out as reality hit her. Her son had gone to war without her knowledge, had been placed in mortal danger while she thought he was safe in class, and was now dead at 17, in a place she could barely locate on a map. The pain was compounded by betrayal, by anger that the system had allowed her underage son to lie about his age and go to war, by guilt that she hadn't realized. She would never know, not for decades, that Robert had been placed on that specific ship, in that specific position, as part of a deliberate strategy that treated young, inexperienced recruits as acceptable tactical sacrifices. The truth would have been unbearable. Robert was not unique. Between November 7, 1943 and the end of the war in August 1945, approximately 1,800 American sailors under the age of 18 were killed in action in the Pacific Theater, the vast majority serving on escort cruisers or destroyers positioned on perimeter formations as part of layered defense doctrine. Their mothers, fathers, brothers, and sisters received terse telegrams reporting deaths, but never explaining the strategic context that had placed these boys in particular danger. Classified documents detailing personnel distribution policies remained secret for 5 decades. When they were finally partially declassified, they revealed a coldly calculated system. Younger, less experienced recruits were preferentially assigned to riskier positions because, in the brutal arithmetic of war of attrition, their deaths had less impact on overall combat effectiveness than deaths of experienced veterans would have. It was impeccable logic from a purely military perspective, but morally problematic from any human perspective. Admiral Ernest King, the strategy's final architect, never publicly defended it, but also never expressed regret. In internal memos after the war, he argued that approach had saved an estimated 12,000 to 15,000 American lives generally by preserving experienced crews on more valuable ships, allowing those ships to operate more effectively and end war more quickly. Whether he was correct is impossible to verify, but the grim math was clear. 1,800 young deaths may have prevented 12,000 veteran deaths, and those 12,000 lives saved allowed the war to end months early, potentially saving tens of thousands of Japanese and American civilian lives. But telling mothers that children were strategically sacrificed for the greater good was never a viable political option. The lie of silence continued. On the Japanese side, Captain Genda and his analysts spent weeks after the November 7th attack trying to reconcile their expectations with actual results. Reports from pilots were consistent. American crews were clearly young and inexperienced by traditional criteria, but their inexperience manifested itself in ways that paradoxically increased defensive effectiveness in certain contexts. Veteran gunners conserved ammunition and fired with calculated precision. Rookie gunners dumped ammunition indiscriminately, creating a barrage of volume that, although wasteful and inaccurate, was psychologically intimidating and occasionally fortunately effective. Veterans followed established procedures even under stress. Rookies improvised wildly, creating tactical unpredictability that complicated attack planning. Genda wrote in a confidential report to the Naval High Command, "We underestimated not American capabilities but the nature of their inexperience. Young American crews fight with desperation and unpredictability that experienced crews do not display. They don't know they should conserve ammunition, so they shoot everything. They don't know they should follow established doctrine, so they constantly improvise. This makes coordinated attacks more difficult because we cannot predict their responses using conventional tactical models. I recommend reevaluating our intelligence on enemy crew composition. Youth and inexperience are not necessarily a tactical advantage for us." This analysis never reached higher levels of Japanese command with appropriate urgency. The Japanese military bureaucracy, rigidly hierarchical and resistant to admitting strategic errors, filed Genda's report with dozens of other inconclusive reports. Official recognition that Americans had developed an effective strategy based on exploiting youth as a tactical resource would have required admitting that Japanese planners had fundamentally misinterpreted the nature of the American threat, and such an admission was culturally impossible in a military structure where saving face was almost as important as tactical victory. Through 1944, pattern continued. The United States Navy expanded recruitment, accepting progressively younger volunteers with progressively looser age verification. Recruiting officials, under pressure to fill rising quotas to cruise ships leaving shipyards in record numbers, often ignored obviously altered birth certificates or accepted verbal declarations of age without documentation. Post-war estimates suggest that at the peak of 1944, approximately 9,000 sailors under the age of 18 were serving on surface ships in the Pacific, a number that does not include unknown numbers of young men using documents from older brothers or completely falsified certificates. Their mothers, the overwhelming majority, didn't know. They received carefully censored letters that mentioned sailor life in vague terms, but did not reveal specific locations or dangers faced. Military mail systems ensured that letters took weeks to arrive, allowing young men to maintain illusions of security, even as they sailed to combat zones. When casual telegrams arrived, they came as an absolute shock to families who had no idea which children were even in danger. Sarah Martinez, mother of David Martinez, who had served on Robert McCarthy's team, received notification of her son's death in March 1944 after a Japanese torpedo attack sank the USS Chicago in the Second Battle. She had believed that David was working in an aircraft factory in San Diego, a story that David had carefully constructed with the complicity of a friend who posted letters from there. When the casualty officer explained that David had died at sea, Sarah initially insisted there had been a mistake. "My David is 17, she said. "He can't be in the Navy. He's too young. He's in San Diego working. He wrote to me last week." The officer patiently explained that David had lied about his age, had enlisted, and had been killed. Sarah went through denial, anger, and finally overwhelming pain that never completely left her. She died in 1968, 24 years after David's death, never knowing that her son had been part of a deliberate strategy that placed young recruits in positions of greater danger. Truth would have been additional cruelty on top of tragedy. Statistically, strategy worked exactly as designed, as survival rates for modern aircraft carriers and battleships crewed by experienced veterans were significantly higher than for escort cruisers and destroyers crewed by conscripts. Combat effectiveness of capital ships remained high throughout the war, while escort ships were treated as partially expendable, replaceable from continued production. Classified operational analyses showed that loss of escort cruiser manned by recruits had minimal impact on overall task force combat capability, because experienced crews on capital ships could compensate. Loss of veteran-manned aircraft carriers, by contrast, created a hole in operational capability that took months to fill through training replacements. Therefore, from a purely operational standpoint, the strategy of using young recruits as shields to protect veterans was not only defensible, but obviously correct. The human cost, however, was staggeringly uneven. Sailors under the age of 20 represented approximately 32% of naval personnel in the Pacific Theater, but suffered 49% of combat casualties. They were almost twice as likely to die as older comrades, not primarily because they were less skilled, although that contributed, but because they were systematically placed in positions of greater risk. Personnel distribution documents, when finally declassified, revealed that recruits with less than 6 months of service were assigned to escort cruisers and destroyers at a rate of 83%, while veterans with more than 18 months of service were assigned to these same ship types at a rate of just 22%. Disparity was not an accident or bureaucratic inefficiency. It was deliberate policy codified in classified directives. Timothy Chen survived the war but carried deep psychological wounds. He witnessed Robert McCarthy's death when bomb fragments decapitated his friend while they were operating his gun together. Timothy saw James O'Brien die. He saw William Jackson lose both legs in secondary explosion. He survived 3 shipwrecks, was rescued twice, and spent a total of 87 days in active combat before he was 18. When the war ended, Timothy was 19 and looked 40. He returned to San Francisco, tried to attend college using veterans' benefits, but was unable to concentrate in classes. Nightmares woke him up screaming 3 or 4 nights a week. He drank to sleep, started skipping classes, eventually dropped out. He worked a series of manual jobs, never married, and died of cirrhosis of the liver in 1972 at the age of 46. His Veterans Hospital medical records document severe post-traumatic stress disorder and chronic depression, but in 1972, these diagnoses still carried massive social stigma and received inadequate treatment. Timothy never talked about the war to anyone except other veterans at the veteran bar he frequented in Chinatown. He certainly never mentioned to anyone that he had served illegally at the age of 17, that he had been part of a strategy that treated young recruits as expendable resources, or that he felt deep bitterness not about having served but about having been deliberately placed in excessive danger because of his age and inexperience. This bitterness, unexpressed and unprocessed, ate at him from within for 27 years until his premature death. William Jackson, Robert's team leader who lost both legs in a secondary explosion during the sinking of the USS Chicago, survived physically but faced a life of immense challenges. He spent 14 months in a naval hospital in San Diego, relearning basic life skills, then returned to Birmingham, Alabama, where he faced not only the challenges of physical disability but also the brutal racial segregation of the Jim Crow South. Jackson was black, and Alabama in 1945 did not provide adequate facilities for disabled black veterans. He fought for 4 years to receive full disability benefits, facing bureaucracy that seemed determined to deny him appropriate compensation. He eventually opened a small radio workshop, got married, had 3 children, and lived until 1996, dying at the age of 72. In a videotaped interview in 1993 as part of a World War II Veterans Oral History project, Jackson, then 69, spoke publicly about his experience for the first time. "We were children," he said, his voice calm but filled with repressed emotion. "I was 19 years old and the senior of the group. I had 4 boys under my command, none older than 18, 2 were 17, and had lied to enlist. We didn't know anything. 6 days of training, and then they sent us into the combat zone against Japanese pilots who had been flying combat missions for 5 years. He stopped, his eyes going distant. I lost those boys, all of them. Robert McCarthy, 17, killed by bomb fragments. James O'Brien, 18, killed in the same explosion. David Martinez, 17, killed when ship sank. Timothy Chen survived physically but not mentally. I heard he died young, drink, and I survived but lost my legs." He looked directly at the camera. "We were sent there to die, you know. It's not that commanders didn't care, it's that we were part of the plan. Put the boys on the ships you expect to lose. Save the experienced men for ships you want to keep. Makes military sense, I suppose. Cold as hell, but it makes sense." He wiped away tears that began to fall. "Our mothers never knew. They thought we were just unlucky, that it was a fluke of war. It wasn't chance, it was strategy." This interview, conducted 48 years after the end of the war, was one of the few times that an actual participant in the strategy publicly articulated its nature and human impact. Most of the veterans who served on these ships as teenagers never spoke about the experience, silently carrying the knowledge that they had been treated like expendable chess pieces in a larger game. Many they took this knowledge to their graves, leaving families wondering why men who had survived war remained so scarred by it decades later. The Japanese response to American strategy evolved gradually through war. When reports accumulated showing that attacks on outlying escort ships were producing unsustainable attrition rates, while allowing key American assets to remain untouched, Japanese commanders adjusted tactics to focus more exclusively on aircraft carriers, attempting to ignore escort ships. But this was easier said than done. American defensive formations made it virtually impossible to reach aircraft carriers without first penetrating multiple layers of escort cruisers and destroyers, and even inexperienced crews on these ships could inflict enough damage on attacking aircraft to reduce the effectiveness of strikes against key targets. The American strategy worked precisely because it forced the Japanese to choose between accepting losses in attacks on escort ships of secondary value or accepting even greater losses in attempts to penetrate directly to primary targets. It was a dilemma with no good answer. Japanese commanders, gradually realizing that Americans had developed a systematic approach that exploited Japan's own forces against them, experienced increasing frustration. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, 57 years old, fleet commander who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, wrote in a private diary in April 1944, "The Americans turned weakness into strength. Their young crews are supposed to be vulnerable, but they use them as expendable armor that we must penetrate to reach valuable targets. Every escort ship we sink costs us aircraft and pilots we cannot replace while they build 10 escort ships for every one we sink. It is a war of attrition that we cannot win, but avoiding it means allowing aircraft carriers to operate with impunity." Nagumo, depressed by continued setbacks and realizing the war was lost, committed ritual suicide in July 1944 after the Battle of Saipan. His diary, recovered after the war, has provided historians rare insight into the thinking of a senior Japanese commander, grappling with implications of American personnel deployment strategy. When the war ended in August 1945, approximately 12,000 men who had served as under-18 recruits on surface ships in the Pacific were still alive, although many carried physical or psychological wounds that would stay with them for life. They returned home, resumed interrupted lives, and in most cases never spoke about their experiences to family or friends. Post-war American culture did not encourage veterans to discuss trauma, and masculinity of the era emphasized stoic silence over emotional suffering. The result was that thousands of men privately processed experiences of being used as human bait as teenagers, with no social or therapeutic structure to help them understand or reconcile complex feelings of pride in having served mixed with resentment at being treated as disposable. Their mothers, when they learned that their sons had served illegally while minors, reacted with a mixture of pride, horror, and relief that their sons had survived. Those whose children did not return carried grief compounded by feelings of betrayal, that society had allowed minor children to lie to go to war, and then placed them in mortal danger without parental knowledge or consent. Catherine McCarthy, Robert's mother, never fully recovered. She kept Robert's room exactly as he had left it until her own death in 1982, 39 years after his death. She visited his grave at the National Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu once, in 1964, and left a sealed letter asking for forgiveness for not realizing what he had done, for not protecting him from himself. The letter, recovered by cemetery workers, is preserved in National Archives, testimony to the lasting pain of a mother who lost her son to a war strategy she never fully understood. Gradually, through post-war decades, truth about deliberate distribution of young personnel to high-risk positions emerged in fragments. Military historians have noticed statistical patterns in casualty records. Veterans like William Jackson began speaking in oral history interviews. Classified documents were gradually declassified. In 1995, when the Department of Defense declassified Rear Admiral Turner's memos on personnel deployment strategy, Finnish journalists, they were finally able to tell the complete story. A front-page article in the New York Times in November 1995, 52 years after attacks that killed Robert McCarthy and so many others, detailed how the Navy knowingly placed young recruits on more vulnerable ships as part of a layered defense strategy. Public reaction was mixed. Some, particularly World War II veterans and military historians, defended strategy as the brutal necessity of total war, arguing that alternatives would have resulted in more deaths overall. Others, particularly families of veterans who died young, expressed anger that the truth had been hidden for 5 decades. Department of Defense issued a statement acknowledging that strategy had existed, but emphasizing that it had been implemented within existing military regulations of the time and had contributed to Allied victory. The statement offered no apology, but also expressed no regret, a position that infuriated some, but was accepted by others as appropriate historical honesty about the realities of war. Debate continues among historians about the ethics of strategy. Nobody disputes that it worked militarily. The question remains whether it was morally justifiable to treat teenage soldiers as disproportionately expendable resources in the name of greater operational efficiency. In 2003, 58 years after the end of the war, the United States Navy dedicated a small but moving memorial at Naval Base San Diego to all sailors who served while under the age of 18 during World War II. The memorial lists names of 1,800 confirmed dead, although the actual number may be higher because some records have been lost or destroyed. The dedication ceremony was attended by approximately 120 surviving veterans who had served underage, many now in their 70s or 80s, accompanied by family members. Timothy Chen was not present, having died 31 years earlier. William Jackson attended in a wheelchair, now in his 80s, accompanied by his 3 children and 7 grandchildren. During the ceremony, Jackson was invited to speak. He rolled up to the microphone, looked out over the crowd of hundreds, and spoke briefly. "We were children sent to do men's work," he began. "Many of us did not return. Those who returned were forever changed." He paused, composing himself. This memorial is not about politics or strategy or historical debates. It's about remembering boys who died before they had a chance to live. It's about honoring your mothers who never knew the whole truth. He looked at the list of names engraved in black granite. Robert McCarthy, Timothy Chen, James O'Brien, David Martinez, and 1,796 others. We remember. The crowd remained silent for a full minute, the sound only of waves crashing against nearby docks and the silent weeping of relatives who had lost fathers, brothers, uncles 60 years before. The memorial remains today, visited occasionally by history students, families of veterans, and rarely by the elderly surviving veteran coming to pay final respects to comrades who never grew old. The lesson of this story is not simple or comfortable. War demands brutal choices, and commanders must make decisions about how to use limited resources, including human lives, to achieve strategic objectives. Rear Admiral Turner and his colleagues faced a genuine problem. They could not train sailors as quickly as they could build ships, and they needed to find a way to maximize combat effectiveness with available personnel. His solution, concentrating experience on more valuable assets and accepting higher losses on less valuable assets manned by conscripts, was logical under the pressure of existential warfare. But logic does not eliminate the moral cost of treating teenage human beings as expendable chess pieces, especially when many had lied about their ages precisely because they were too young to fully understand the risk they were taking. A system that allowed and even facilitated the enlistment of minors, then systematically placed them in greater danger, carries responsibility that transcends military justification. Mothers who lost children without ever knowing that they had been strategically positioned to absorb enemy damage carried pain that was compounded by forced ignorance. Catherine McCarthy died without fully knowing why Robert was on that ship that day. True, when it finally emerged decades later, it brought not peace but a new layer of pain to surviving families. The knowledge that losses were not simply tragic chance, but the result of cold calculation. There is no satisfactory resolution to this moral dilemma. War is inherently immoral, and debates about gradations of war and immorality within it are philosophical exercises that offer little comfort to the dead or their mourners. What remains is an obligation to remember honestly, to recognize real costs of strategic choices, and to ensure that those who paid the highest prices are recognized not just as statistics in casual reports, but as individuals whose lives were cut short in the name of causes they barely fully understood. Robert James McCarthy was a boy of 17 years and 11 months who dreamed of curing polio and died on the deck of a ship in the South Pacific, used as bait to protect more valuable targets. Your mother never knew the whole truth. Now we know, and we must carry that knowledge with appropriate honesty about what war really costs and who really pays.